Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 12th, 2023. My report today is going to be titled, Idiots in the West Are Clueless. Although let me add to that some are just plain evil, as we'll see as the report unfolds. The question I'm going to start with is, what did we learn from the G20 summit that just concluded in Delhi, India? And the main point is that the Unipolar Order has been significantly weakened by its own incompetence and stupidity and by the emergence of a new potential arising from the global South. The G7 can no longer dictate policy. The key to the Unipolar Order was the control of credit and financial institutions backed up by military power. But the military power has been exposed as less than powerful by the results of the situation in Ukraine. And the financial system in the West is teetering. It's never been committed to the development of the poorer countries. But what we can see is that it's now cannibalizing its own populations. So all of this was reflected in the final communique that came out from the G20 summit. Now, it was reported by one of the Indian officials who was involved in the negotiations that there were 200 hours of discussion, of debate over the final communique, 15 drafts, and what was finally produced created a storm of protest from the G7 governments. It was a very significant shift from last year, where the G20 condemned Russia. This year, no condemnation of Russia. And this was very important because this is what was being pushed by the Blinkens and the Sunaks and the Jens Stoltenberg and others from the West, who wanted a very strong condemnation of Russia and got nothing. Also, there was very weak support for the green transition, so-called, because the Global South refused to ban fossil fuels, is moving ahead with development of more efficient and energy-intense policies for energy production. And there's a recognition in the global North now that the energy shift to so-called renewables is a mistake, that the less efficient energy sources cost more and are leading to a deindustrialization, especially here in Germany. So there are several comments that stand out that demonstrate these points that I'm going to give you that reveal the reality of what's occurring, that you're still not receiving adequate reports on this from the Western media or political leaders, but you'll get the truth from us. And the truth is out there if you look for it on the internet, even though there's a vicious campaign of censorship. So let's start with what Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov said about the final communique. He said that Western reports of the isolation of Russia and so on are, quote, ridiculous. They're full of rumors and gossip. And he praised the Indian leadership at the G20 summit for weeding this out and producing a document that reflects the thinking of the entire global majority. Except, of course, what's outside the global majority, which is the G7. An example of this was Indian Foreign Minister Jai Shankar, who was asked about complaints about the final communique, about the failure to condemn Russia on Ukraine. And here's what he said, quote, "The people who are putting it that way are not really understanding what is happening in the world," unquote. Listen to that again. They're not really understanding what is happening in the world. In other words, he's putting politely that they're clueless or evil because they're missing the greatest change in modern history with the rise of the global South, what some people are calling the second wave of decolonization. Then we had the comments of Brazil's President Lula. Brazil will preside over the next G20 summit next year. And what he said is, quote, "We cannot let geopolitical issues sequester the G20 agenda of discussions," unquote. Now, what he means by geopolitical is exactly what Lyndon and Helga Zepp LaRouche have always meant when they talked about geopolitics. Geopolitics is a British approach to strategic policy which divides countries against each other for the benefit, when it was first developed in the early 1900s, for the benefit of the British Empire, but it is now for the so-called northern or western powers, the transatlantic powers, dominated by the United States, and at least in the minds of some of its leaders, the United Kingdom. But geopolitics is not about strategic discussion per se. It's about keeping the South down and protecting the predatory rights of the great powers. And in that sense, it's a doctrine that fits the idea of the unipolar order. And Lula said, we're not going to have geopolitics anymore. And that's what Helga Zepp LaRouche has said is the key to establishing an order based on peaceful cooperation. Now, you also have the comment from Ukraine's foreign ministry, quote, the G20 has nothing to be proud of, unquote, because the handouts to Ukraine were not a central feature of the discussion. And it's clear in the minds of at least some of the participants of the North that the Ukraine counteroffensive is failing and will not succeed. Now, finally, just for fun for my Canadian friends, we have the spokesman for the City of London cartels in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who lamented the failure to get tougher language on the green transition. He said, we worked hard, but he whined, we worked hard to get as strong language as we possibly could, unquote. But the pressure from the North did not succeed. Now, let me point to one reality that you may not be aware of, which is that companies engaged in wind energy are starting to opt out. Zero Hedge has a report that the world's largest wind turbine producer, Ørsted, is saying now that it can only continue with plans for the major offshore wind farm on the U.S. East Coast if the Biden administration grants what it calls Ukraine-style aid. In other words, tens of billions of dollars for wind energy. Well, that's not going to happen. And the CEO of Ørsted said, quote, the situation in U.S. offshore wind is severe. It is a warning sign that the green energy revolution bubble is in trouble, unquote. As it should be, because it's a boondoggle that has nothing to do with producing energy, just as the Ukraine war has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. There's a rejection going on of the green revolution, and nations of the global South recognize this. That's why they rejected the EU green transition plan that was presented by Macron at a summit about 2 months ago, and instead are turning to major projects such as hydroelectric dams, use of coal and fossil fuels, as well as working with China and Russia to develop nuclear power. And South Africa also has some very advanced nuclear power systems. Now, Dilma Rousseff, the chairwoman of the New Development Bank of the BRICS, recently called attention to the Grand Inga Dam project in Africa, which was something that Ramaphosa, the South African president, raised in the Macron summit. He said to Macron, instead of a $1 trillion tax boondoggle that will fund green projects, how about $60 billion for the Grand Inga Dam project? To construct a series of dams on the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which will generate 40,000 megawatts of electric power for a number of countries in Africa. And this was part of the discussion at the BRICS summit, the development of the African continent. And we're seeing leaders in Africa moving away from colonialism, rejecting the European paternalistic control, which said, your resources are only good for us. If you use them, it will boil the planet over, as Obama said. So we're seeing that rebellion again at the G20 summit. Now, what's the West response? Prolong the war in Ukraine. Threaten Russia. The intent is to weaken Russia because Russia has played a leading role in allowing the voices of the global South to be heard. There's also the targeting of China, using Taiwan, using Biden's trip to Vietnam, the issues of the South China Sea. What are they upset about with China? that China has emerged as an economic power committed to the development of the global South, while the Biden administration is a weak and aging power trying to continue the corporate cartel looting of the poorest countries on the planet. And so we're seeing prolonging war for the purpose of weakening Russia and China. So when will the US and European politicians realize that this is not only a dangerous provocation leading toward possibly World War III, but is destroying economies in the West? What Helga Zepp-LaRouche warned would be a boomerang effect. Now, we had a conference on September 9th, and I'll link it again in the description section, where people from a number of countries, very important officials, including from the United States, got together to discuss the transition to a new strategic and development architecture. And it's clear that we need to fight for this change. Now, think about this question of the clueless. Despite the total censorship, the spying on the population that was part of the East German communist regime, the people of East Germany, which were called living in the Valley of the Clueless because they had no access to Western media. At that time, the only thing they had was the controlled media of the East German communist government. Nevertheless, they rose up and overthrew that government and brought down the Berlin Wall. Now, will the American and European populations show the willingness to fight, the intelligence and the courage to take on our elites, our establishment, when it's clearly acting against our interests? That's the question for today. So look at the video of our event last Saturday. Take the time to watch the speeches and marvel at the collection of governments from around the world or officials from around the world who spoke about this transition and came to the Schiller Institute conference to do that. Share that video, share this video, and join with us to take us out of the Valley of the Clueless.